The air was heavy with the promise of rain as the sun dipped below the horizon in the small, sleepy town of Oakwood. The streets were quiet except for the faint hum of distant crickets. A group of 4 kids, Jamal, Tyrell, Deshaun, and little Maya, walked down the sidewalk, laughing and trading jokes. They had spent the afternoon at the community park, playing basketball and sharing dreams of what they wanted to be when they grew up. It was supposed to be a carefree summer evening. Jamal, the oldest of the group at 15, led the way. His tall frame and confident stride made him the natural leader among the kids. Behind him, Maya, who was only 9, skipped along, her pigtails bouncing with every step. Deshaun and Tyrell, both 13, brought up the rear, arguing about which superhero could win in a fight. As they passed a row of abandoned warehouses on the edge of town, a patrol car cruised by slowly. Its headlights cut through the dim light, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Inside the car sat Officer Malcolm Keenan, a figure all too familiar to the residents of Oakwood. Known for his hard-nosed attitude and questionable treatment of the town's black community, Keenan was a man who thrived on intimidation. Keenan's cold blue eyes scanned the group of kids through the windshield. His lip curled into a sneer as he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. To him, they weren't just kids, they were trouble waiting to happen. With a deliberate motion, he turned the patrol car onto the sidewalk, blocking their path. "Hey!" Keenan barked as he stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. "What are you kids doing out here? This ain't your neighborhood." Jamal instinctively stepped forward, shielding the younger kids behind him. "We're just walking home, sir," he said, his voice steady but wary. He knew better than to show fear, especially around someone like Keenan. Keenan's eyes narrowed as he sauntered closer, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "You look like you're up to no good. Maybe tagging walls or breaking windows. You punks think you can just roam wherever you want." "We didn't do anything wrong," Jamal said firmly. "We're just trying to get home." Keenan smirked, a predatory glint in his eyes. "We'll see about that." He reached for his radio, speaking into it with an air of authority. "Possible suspects on foot near the old warehouse district. Stand by for backup." Jamal's stomach churned. Backup? For what? They hadn't done anything. He glanced at his friends, their faces pale with fear, and knew they had to get out of there. "Run!" Jamal shouted. The kids didn't hesitate. They bolted down the sidewalk, their feet pounding against the pavement as adrenaline surged through their veins. Keenan's voice rang out behind them, barking commands and insults, but they didn't look back. The sound of barking erupted from the patrol car, sharp and menacing. Jamal's heart sank as he realized what was coming. Keenan had brought his K-9 unit, a pair of trained security dogs, known for their ferocity. "You think you can run from me?" Keenan bellowed, releasing the dogs from the back of his car. The animals surged forward, their snarls filling the air as they chased the kids. The group darted into a narrow alley, the walls closing in around them. Maya struggled to keep up, her small legs pumping furiously. Jamal slowed just enough to grab her hand and pull her along, urging her to move faster. "We've got to split up," Tyrell shouted, panic in his voice. "They can't follow all of us." "No," Jamal barked back. "We stay together." The dog's barks grew louder, closer. The kids rounded a corner and found themselves in a dead end, a chain-link fence blocking their path. Jamal cursed under his breath. They had nowhere to go. "Climb," he ordered, hoisting Maya up first. She scrambled over the fence, her hands trembling as she gripped the metal. Tyrell and Deshaun followed, their movements frantic as the dogs closed in. Jamal was halfway up the fence when the first dog lunged, its teeth snapping inches from his foot. He kicked out instinctively, his shoe connecting with the dog's snout. The animal yelped but didn't back down, its partner joining the fray. On the other side of the fence, Maya screamed as the kids scrambled to help Jamal over. Just as his feet hit the ground, Keenan appeared at the mouth of the alley, his gun drawn. "Stop right there!" Keenan shouted, his voice echoing off the brick walls. The kids froze, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Keenan's face was twisted with rage as he advanced, the dogs at his side. He raised his gun, pointing it directly at Jamal. "You think you can outrun me? You think you're untouchable?" Keenan snarled. "You little punks need to be taught a lesson." Jamal's hands balled into fists as he stepped in front of Maya, shielding her with his body. His heart hammered in his chest, but he refused to back down. "We didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. Keenan laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Wrong? You exist. That's enough for me." Before Keenan could take another step, the sound of a distant car engine roared to life. Headlights swept across the alley, and a black SUV skidded to a stop behind Keenan. The doors flew open, and two men in tactical gear jumped out, their weapons drawn. "Drop your gun," one of them barked. Keenan spun around, his face contorted with shock. "Who the hell are you?" "Federal agents," the man replied, his voice firm. "You're under investigation, Officer Keenan." "Drop the weapon now." The alley seemed to vibrate with tension as the two federal agents stood firm, their weapons trained on Keenan. The barking of the dogs echoed off the brick walls, heightening the chaos. For a moment, Keenan hesitated, his grip on his pistol tightening as if weighing his options. "You don't want to do this," Keenan sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I'm an officer of the law. I have authority." One of the agents, a tall man with a chiseled jawline, stepped forward. "You're under investigation for multiple abuses of power and excessive force, Keenan. We have evidence, and this ends now. Drop the weapon." Keenan's jaw clenched, his eyes darting between the agents and the group of terrified kids huddled behind the fence. He had built his reputation on intimidation and control, and the idea of losing that grip enraged him. "I'm not going down because of a bunch of brats and overzealous bureaucrats," he spat. The second agent, a shorter but equally imposing woman with sharp eyes, didn't flinch. "This isn't up for debate. Drop the gun, or we'll drop you." Realizing he was cornered, Keenan let out a growl of frustration. Slowly, he lowered his weapon, his fingers trembling with suppressed rage. The dogs, sensing the shift in their handler's demeanor, quieted but remained tense, their eyes locked on the kids. Jamal exhaled a shaky breath, his arms still protectively wrapped around Maya. The sight of the federal agents brought a glimmer of hope, but he wasn't ready to relax just yet. He had seen too many situations where justice was promised but never delivered. The female agent gestured toward Keenan's belt. "Now, release the dogs." Immediately. Keenan hesitated, his lip curling in defiance. "You think you can waltz in here and tell me how to do my job? These animals are trained to protect." "Release them," the male agent barked, cutting him off. His voice carried a sharp edge that left no room for argument. With a visible sneer, Keenan unclipped the leashes. The dogs trotted a few feet away, their aggression momentarily subdued. The agents moved in, cuffing Keenan's hands behind his back. He glared at them, his defiance unbroken even as the cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists. "You're making a mistake," Keenan snarled as they began to lead him toward their SUV. "This town needs me. Without me, these streets will go to hell." The male agent didn't dignify his rant with a response. Instead, he turned to the kids, his expression softening. "Are you all okay?" he asked, holstering his weapon. Jamal stepped forward cautiously, still holding Maya's hand. "We're fine, but who are you? Why are you here?" The female agent offered a reassuring smile. We're with the Department of Justice. We've been tracking Keenan for months. He's been abusing his power for years, and tonight, he crossed a line we couldn't ignore. Jamal's eyes narrowed. You mean you knew he was dangerous, but you let him keep working? The agent's smile faltered. It's complicated, she admitted. Building a case takes time, and we needed undeniable proof to act. What happened tonight, his actions against you, gave us what we needed to finally stop him. Jamal's fists clenched at his sides. So, we had to suffer for you to do your job. The male agent stepped in, his voice calm but firm. I know it doesn't seem fair, and I don't blame you for being angry. But we're here now, and we're going to make sure Keenan faces justice. Deshawn, who had been silent up until now, spoke up. What about us? What if someone else like him comes after us? The agents exchanged a glance, the weight of the question evident in their expressions. The female agent crouched down to Maya's level, her tone gentle but resolute. We're going to make sure you're safe. Keenan won't hurt anyone else. As they spoke, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. More law enforcement vehicles arrived, their lights flashing as officers poured onto the scene. The kids tensed, their fear reigniting at the sight of more police, but the agents reassured them. These officers are here to help, the male agent explained. We've coordinated with trustworthy members of the force to ensure this situation is handled properly. One of the newly arrived officers, a black woman with kind eyes, approached the group. She knelt down, addressing Maya directly. Hi there, sweetie. My name's Officer Daniels. You're safe now, okay? Maya nodded hesitantly, her grip on Jamal's hand loosening slightly. Daniels turned her attention to Jamal, her tone serious. I know tonight was terrifying, but you were brave. You protected your friends and kept them safe. That's no small thing. Jamal's shoulders relaxed marginally at her words, but the fire in his eyes remained. What happens now? He asked. Daniels glanced at the agents before answering. Keenan will be taken into custody and face charges for what he's done. As for you, we'll make sure you get home safely. The kids exchanged uncertain looks. The events of the evening had shaken them deeply, and the idea of simply returning home felt surreal. But they knew they couldn't stay in the alley forever. As the agents loaded Keenan into their SUV, he cast one last venomous glare at the kids. This isn't over, he hissed, his voice barely audible over the commotion. You'll regret this. Jamal met his gaze head-on, his voice steady and unwavering. We're not afraid of you. The SUV door slammed shut, silencing Keenan's threats. The agents climbed into the vehicle, their job far from over but this chapter of it complete. Officer Daniels stayed with the kids, her presence a calming anchor in the aftermath of the chaos. As the night deepened, the kids were escorted home, each of them carrying the weight of what they had just experienced. But even as they walked away, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished, that the events of this night would ripple far beyond the confines of their small town. The following day, Oakwood was buzzing with activity. News of Officer Keenan's arrest had spread like wildfire. People whispered in grocery store aisles, murmured over steaming cups of coffee at the local diner, and debated on the corner where the old general store once stood. For some, it was a vindication of what they had known all along, that Keenan was a danger, a powder keg waiting to explode. For others, it was a shocking revelation, a blow to the image of law and order they clung to. Jamal sat on the front steps of his house, absently spinning a basketball between his hands. His mind raced with thoughts of the previous night. He couldn't shake the image of Keenan's face twisted with hatred or the snarling dogs lunging at his feet. Every time he closed his eyes, it played on a loop, a vivid nightmare he couldn't escape. Maya sat beside him, her knees pulled to her chest. She hadn't said much since they returned home. Her usual bright demeanor was replaced with a quiet solemnity that made Jamal's chest ache. He glanced at her, his voice soft. You okay, Maya? She shrugged, her gaze fixed on the ground. Do you think he'll come back? Jamal set the basketball down and put a comforting hand on her shoulder. No, he said firmly. He's gone. The agents took him away. He can't hurt us anymore. But even as he said it, a sliver of doubt crept into his mind. Keenan's parting words echoed in his ears, this isn't over. The sound of footsteps on the gravel driveway pulled Jamal from his thoughts. He looked up to see Deshaun and Tyrell approaching, their expressions a mixture of anger and determination. Tyrell carried a small notebook, the edges worn and frayed, while Deshaun had his phone out, recording everything as he often did. Jamal, Tyrell said, his voice low but urgent. We need to talk. Jamal frowned, standing up. What's going on? Tyrell held up the notebook. We've been doing some digging. Keenan's not the only one. There are more cops in this town who've been working with him. People who've been covering for him, helping him get away with this stuff. Jamal's stomach dropped. Are you sure? Deshaun nodded, flipping his phone around to show a series of screenshots. We found online forums where people were talking about Keenan. Complaints, stories about what he's done, even some anonymous tits about other officers. It's bigger than just him. Maya's eyes widened. Does that mean they'll come after us? Tyrell crouched down to her level, his voice gentle but firm. No one's going to hurt you, Maya. We're going to make sure of that. Jamal rubbed the back of his neck, his thoughts racing. So, what do we do? If this is bigger than Keenan, we can't just sit here and wait for something to happen. Tyrell opened the notebook, flipping through pages filled with names, dates, and hastily scribbled notes. We build a case. Just like those agents did with Keenan. If we can find enough evidence, we can take it to them. Deshaun added, and we record everything. If something happens, we make sure people know the truth. Jamal hesitated. The idea of going up against more cops was daunting, but the alternative, doing nothing, was worse. He looked at Maya, her small face lined with worry, and felt a surge of resolve. Okay, he said. Let's do it. The group spent the next several days gathering information. They talked to neighbors, some of whom shared their own stories of harassment and intimidation. They combed through public records, looking for patterns in arrests and complaints. And all the while, they stayed vigilant, watching for any sign that someone might be watching them. One evening, as they huddled in Jamal's room, sorting through their findings, the sound of a car engine idling outside made them freeze. Jamal peered through the curtains, his heart pounding. A black SUV was parked across the street, its windows tinted so dark he couldn't see who was inside. Is it them? Maya whispered, clutching Jamal's arm. I don't know, he murmured. Stay here. Before anyone could stop him, Jamal slipped outside, his movements careful and deliberate. He approached the SUV, his fists clenched at his sides. As he neared the driver's side window, it rolled down to reveal a familiar face, the male agent from the night before. Agent Carter? Jamal said, his voice a mix of relief and confusion. What are you doing here? Carter stepped out of the vehicle, his expression serious. We need to talk. Inside the house, the group gathered around as Carter explained the situation. We've received credible threats against you, he said. Keenan may be in custody, but he has allies who aren't happy about what happened. They know you were witnesses. Jamal's jaw tightened. So what do we do? Carter leaned forward, his voice firm. You stick to your routine, but stay alert. Don't go anywhere alone, and if anything feels off, call me immediately. We've stationed agents in the area to keep an eye on things. Tyrell crossed his arms, his skepticism evident. And what about the other cops working with Keenan? Are you doing anything about them? Carter nodded. We're building a case, just like you are. But these things take time. You need to be patient. Jamal exchanged a glance with his friends. Patience wasn't their strong suit, but they didn't have much of a choice. As Carter left, promising to keep them updated, the group resolved to keep digging, no matter how dangerous it might be. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. Deshawn's phone was hacked, erasing weeks' worth of recordings. Tyrell's house was vandalized, a chilling message scrawled across the garage door, "Stay out of it." Jamal knew they were being watched. And as much as he wanted to protect his friends, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Welcome to a story hub dedicated to exposing, understanding, and discussing stories. Here, we dive deep into real-life experiences. By sharing these stories, we hope to create awareness, inspire change, and encourage open dialogue. If you're passionate about building a fairer world, please join us. Like the tension in Oakwood became palpable, to support like a storm brewing, keep up with news stories each days. Word of Tyrell's vandalized garage spread quickly among the kids, leaving everyone on edge. The message scrawled across the door, "Stay out of it," was both a threat and a challenge. It was a chilling reminder that the fight they had taken on wasn't just about Keenan, it was about dismantling a web of corruption that reached farther than they had imagined. Jamal couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house felt like a warning, every shadow outside the window a potential danger. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the last few days. He knew they were in over their heads, but backing down wasn't an option. Not after everything they'd been through. Not after what those kids had suffered. The next morning, Jamal called Tyrell and Deshawn over. Maya joined them, her determined expression betraying her fear. "We need to step things up," Jamal said, his voice firm. "They're trying to scare us, but we can't let them win." Tyrell frowned, his arms crossed. "Easier said than done. They hacked Deshawn's phone. They know where I live. What's stopping them from coming after all of us?" Jamal looked at him, his gaze steady. "That's exactly why we have to keep going. If we stop now, they'll think they've won. But if we push harder, if we find something big enough, we can expose all of them." Deshawn nodded, his jaw set. "We need to be smarter. More careful. No more keeping everything on one device. We back everything up, hide copies where they can't find them." Maya chimed in, her voice quiet but resolute. "And we tell people. The more people know, the harder it'll be for them to cover it up." The group spent the next few days putting their plan into action. They reached out to trusted community members, sharing their findings and rallying support. They started an anonymous social media account, posting evidence of the corruption they had uncovered. And they continued digging, piecing together a picture of a police force rife with abuse and complicity. But the more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. One evening, as Jamal was walking home from the library, he noticed a car trailing him. At first, he thought it was a coincidence, but when he turned onto a side street and the car followed, his heart began to race. He ducked into an alley, pressing himself against the wall as the car rolled past slowly, its headlights sweeping the darkened street. Jamal waited until the car disappeared before darting back onto the main road. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to stay calm, walking briskly until he reached the safety of his house. He locked the door behind him, his breathing ragged, and immediately called Tyrell. "They're watching me," Jamal said, his voice trembling. "They followed me home." Tyrell cursed under his breath. "We need to tell Carter. This is getting out of hand." Jamal hesitated. "And what if he can't help? What if it's up to us to stop this?" The line went quiet for a moment before Tyrell spoke again. "Then we don't stop. No matter what." The next day, the group met at an abandoned community center on the edge of town, a place where they could talk without fear of being overheard. They spread out their findings on a rickety table, poring over police reports, witness statements, and video footage. This, Tyrell said, pointing to a report, is the key. Officer Randall, Keenan's right-hand man, was involved in a raid last year that left 2 people dead. The official story was that it was a drug bust gone wrong, but there were no drugs found at the scene. Witnesses said the raid was completely unprovoked. Deshawn leaned forward, his eyes scanning the report. If we can prove Randall falsified the report, it could blow this whole thing wide open. Jamal nodded, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. Then we focus on Randall. We find out everything we can about him. As they worked, the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside made them freeze. Jamal motioned for everyone to stay quiet as he peeked through a crack in the boarded-up window. His stomach dropped when he saw a squad car parked outside, its lights off. "They found us," Jamal whispered, his voice barely audible. The group scrambled to gather their materials, stuffing papers and USB drives into backpacks. The door rattled, followed by a heavy knock. "Open up," a voice barked. "This is the police." Maya's eyes widened with fear. "What do we do?" Jamal scanned the room, his mind racing. He spotted a back door partially hidden by a stack of chairs. "This way," he whispered, leading the group toward it. They slipped out into the night, their hearts pounding as they darted through the shadows. Behind them, the front door crashed open, and heavy footsteps echoed through the empty building. Jamal led them down an overgrown path, the branches scraping their arms as they ran. They didn't stop until they reached an old playground on the outskirts of town. Gasping for breath, they huddled together, their adrenaline still surging. "We can't keep doing this," Deshawn said, his voice shaking. "They're not just trying to scare us anymore. They're hunting us." Jamal looked at his friends, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. He saw the fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else, determination. "Then we fight back," he said. "We use everything we've got and we bring them down." The tension in the group had reached its breaking point. The confrontation at the abandoned community center was a chilling reminder that they weren't just kids taking on a corrupt system, they were targets. Jamal spent the next day pacing his room, his mind churning with plans and contingencies. The others were just as rattled, but their resolve hadn't wavered. They knew they had to escalate their efforts before it was too late. That evening, the group gathered in Deshawn's basement. The dim light cast long shadows across the room, but the atmosphere was charged with urgency. "We need to act fast," Tyrell said, spreading out the materials they'd managed to salvage. "If they're coming after us like this, it means we're getting close to something big." Maya nodded, her voice steady despite the fear lingering in her eyes. "We have to take what we've got and make it public." "All of it?" Deshawn frowned. "It's risky. If we go public, they'll know exactly who's behind this." "They already know," Jamal said firmly. "And if we don't do something now, they'll bury this, and us with it." The group fell into a tense silence before Deshawn finally nodded. "Okay. Let's do it." Their plan was simple but bold. They would release their findings in a way that couldn't be ignored. Tyrell worked on compiling their evidence into a cohesive narrative, while Deshawn edited the video footage they'd recorded, creating a hard-hitting exposé. Maya drafted a statement for social media, her words a rallying cry for justice. Jamal coordinated their communication, ensuring they had backups in case anything went wrong. As they worked, the basement became a hive of activity. The weight of what they were about to do hung heavy in the air, but it also fueled their determination. They were no longer just kids, they were a movement. By the time they finished, it was nearly dawn. Tyrell leaned back in his chair, his eyes bloodshot but triumphant. "It's ready," he said, holding up a USB drive. "This is everything. If this doesn't get their attention, nothing will." Jamal took the drive, his grip firm. We do this tonight. No turning back. The group spent the day laying low, avoiding their usual haunts and staying off the radar. As night fell, they gathered at a local internet cafe, a nondescript building tucked away in a quiet corner of town. Deshawn plugged the USB drive into a computer, his hand steady despite the tension in the room. "Here we go," he said, hitting the upload button. Within minutes, their exposé was live. The video began with a chilling montage of Keenan's attacks, interspersed with interviews from community members who had suffered under his reign. It outlined the network of corruption within the police force, naming names and providing irrefutable evidence. The social media posts went live simultaneously, tagging local and national news outlets to ensure maximum visibility. As the video spread, the response was immediate. Comments flooded in, ranging from outrage and support to denial and threats. Within hours, their exposé had thousands of views, and the hashtag Justice for Oakwood was trending. But the group barely had time to celebrate before the repercussions began. Jamal's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Some were messages of support, but others were far more sinister. Threats poured in, each one more graphic than the last. Tyrell's parents received a call from someone claiming to be a concerned citizen, warning them to rein in their son before it was too late. Maya's family found their mailbox stuffed with hateful letters. And then came the breaking point. 2 nights after their exposé went live, Jamal woke to the sound of shattering glass. He bolted upright, his heart hammering in his chest. Smoke filled the air, and the acrid smell of gasoline burned his nostrils. He stumbled out of bed, coughing as he realized the truth. Someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail through his bedroom window. "Mom! Dad!" Jamal screamed, rushing to their room. He found them already awake, frantically trying to extinguish the flames. The fire alarm blared, and Maya's terrified cries echoed from down the hall. The family managed to escape, but the damage was done. Their home was reduced to a smoldering shell, and the message was clear: the people they were fighting weren't playing games. The next morning, as Jamal and his family stood outside their charred house, Agent Carter arrived. His face was grim, and his tone left no room for argument. "We're moving you to a safe house," he said. "This is no longer just a case of corruption. This is a matter of life and death." Jamal wanted to argue, to insist that he stay and fight, but his parents' pleading expressions stopped him. Reluctantly, he agreed. The group was split up for their safety, each member relocated to a different secure location. Communication became sporadic, and the sense of unity that had fueled their fight began to waver. But even as they adjusted to their new realities, they knew their work wasn't done. From the safe house, Jamal continued to monitor the fallout from their exposé. Local news stations picked up the story, and protests erupted across Oakwood. Community members demanded accountability, and pressure mounted on the police department to address the allegations. But the forces they were up against weren't backing down. As the protests grew, so did the intimidation tactics. Protest leaders were arrested on dubious charges, and counter-protests filled the streets, sowing division and chaos. Jamal watched it all unfold with a mixture of hope and despair. The fight was far from over, but the stakes had never been higher. And as he sat in the safe house, plotting their next move, the aftermath of the exposé felt like a firestorm now. While the community protests gained momentum, with voices rising against the oppressive system, the retaliation from those in power was swift and brutal. Reports of police raids targeting activists and organizers became frequent. Tension filled the air of Oakwood, turning every corner of the town into a potential flashpoint. Jamal's frustration grew as he sat in the isolation of the safe house. His hands itched to do something, anything, but the fear of putting his family at greater risk kept him in check. That restraint began to waver when Tyrell reached out with a whispered phone call. "I've been tracking Randall," Tyrell said, his voice barely audible over the line. "He's making moves. Meeting with someone high up at the precinct after hours. This could be the break we need. Jamal's heart raced. Do you have proof? Not yet, but I'm working on it, Tyrell replied. I need you and the others to help. I can't do this alone. Jamal hesitated, knowing the risk. But then he thought about the kids, the innocent children who had been terrorized, the families who had suffered. I'm in, he said firmly. Within hours, the group was back in contact, their temporary separation forgotten in the face of their shared purpose. They devised a plan. Tyrell would shadow Randall, while Jamal, Deshaun, and Maya focused on gathering further evidence of his connections. Each of them took on their tasks with a renewed determination, knowing that this could be their last chance to bring the system to its knees. Late one night, Tyrell's surveillance paid off. He followed Randall to a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was surrounded by barbed wire, its floodlights casting stark shadows on the gravel lot. Tyrell parked a safe distance away and watched as Randall met with a group of men in plain clothes. Using the zoom on his phone's camera, Tyrell captured snippets of their conversation. He couldn't hear every word, but phrases like, cover it up, and tighten the leash sent chills down his spine. Then came the bombshell. Randall handed over a thick envelope, which one of the men pocketed before driving off. Tyrell's heart pounded as he uploaded the footage to their shared cloud storage. He knew he had found something significant, but he also knew it painted a target squarely on his back. Meanwhile, Jamal and Maya were working to uncover more about the web of corruption. Maya used her knack for research to dig into public records and financial statements, uncovering discrepancies that hinted at embezzlement and illegal payouts. Jamal focused on finding witnesses who were willing to speak out. It wasn't easy. Fear kept most people silent. But then Jamal found Mrs. Porter. The elderly woman had lived in Oakwood for decades and had seen firsthand the damage caused by Randall and his colleagues. When Jamal knocked on her door, she hesitated, her eyes filled with wariness. But as he explained their mission, her expression softened. I've seen too much to stay quiet, she said, inviting him inside. Mrs. Porter's testimony was damning. She spoke of raids on black-owned businesses, families driven out of their homes, and children arrested without cause. Randall's been doing this for years, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. He thinks he's untouchable. Jamal recorded every word, promising her that her courage wouldn't be in vain. As he left her house, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were close, so close, to exposing the truth. The pressure on the group intensified as their findings piled up. Tyrell's footage, Maya's records, and Mrs. Porter's testimony painted a vivid picture of systemic corruption. But with each new piece of evidence, the danger grew. One night, as Maya was walking home from the library, she noticed a black SUV idling at the curb. Her pulse quickened, and she quickened her pace. The SUV's engine roared to life, and it began to follow her. Maya darted down an alley, her heart pounding in her chest. The SUV skidded to a stop, and two men jumped out, their footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. Maya's fear turned to resolve as she clutched the pepper spray in her pocket. She spun around and aimed, catching one of the men in the face. He screamed in pain, and Maya used the moment to escape, sprinting until she reached a crowded street. She didn't stop running until she was safely inside Tyrell's apartment. They're escalating, Maya said, her voice shaking. They're trying to take us out. Tyrell's jaw clenched. Then we hit them harder. The final piece of their plan came together when Deshaun hacked into Randall's personal accounts. It was a risky move, but the information he found was worth it. Bank transfers to offshore accounts, payments to known criminals, and messages detailing cover-ups. It was all there, laid bare for anyone to see. This is it, Deshaun said, his eyes gleaming with triumph. This is the nail in their coffin. The group compiled their findings into a second exposé, even more damning than the first. They scheduled its release for the next morning, knowing that once it went live, there would be no going back. As they sat together in Tyrell's apartment, their expressions a mix of fear and determination, Jamal spoke. "We've come too far to stop now. No matter what happens, we finish this." The group nodded, their bond stronger than ever. They knew the risks, but they also knew the stakes. For the kids who had been chased by dogs, for the families torn apart by injustice, for Oakwood, they would see this through to the end. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, a prelude to the storm both literal and figurative that was about to erupt. Jamal stared at the clock on the computer screen as the seconds ticked down. At exactly 8 a.m., Deshaun hit publish, launching their second exposé. Within minutes, the video and accompanying files began spreading like wildfire, shared across social media and picked up by local news outlets. The evidence was damning, leaving no room for doubt about the depth of corruption within Oakwood's police force. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Calls flooded City Hall, demanding an investigation into the police department. Crowds gathered outside the precinct, their chants echoing through the streets. But even as the community rallied, the group knew they weren't out of danger yet. If anything, the risks had just escalated. Jamal's phone buzzed with a notification. It was from Agent Carter. The message was brief but urgent: "Stay put. They know where you are." Before he could respond, the roar of engines filled the air. He looked out the window to see a convoy of black SUVs pulling up outside the safe house. His blood ran cold as armed men poured out, their faces grim and determined. "They're here," Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned to his parents, who were already moving to the back door. "We need to go. Now." The family barely made it out before the front door was kicked in. Jamal led them through the backyard, his heart pounding in his chest. Shots rang out, shattering the silence and sending birds scattering into the gray sky. He pushed his parents behind a fence, urging them to keep moving as he turned to see one of the men chasing after them. Jamal reached for the taser Agent Carter had given him, a precaution he never thought he'd have to use. As the man closed in, Jamal fired, the crackle of electricity cutting through the chaos. The man went down, and Jamal didn't wait to see if he'd get back up. He turned and ran, his family's safety his only priority. Meanwhile, at Tyrell's apartment, the scene was equally chaotic. The group had gathered there to monitor the fallout from their exposé, but the celebration was cut short when the power went out. The building was plunged into darkness, the hum of the city outside eerily muted. "They've cut the power," Deshaun said, his voice tense. He moved to the window, peeking through the blinds. "And we've got company." Tyrell grabbed the laptop, stuffing it into a backpack along with the hard drives containing their evidence. "We need to split up," he said. "They can't catch us all." The group hesitated, but Maya nodded. "He's right. We'll regroup later. Stay safe." As they scattered, the sound of boots echoed in the stairwell. Maya darted down the fire escape, her breath coming in short gasps as she hit the ground running. Deshaun and Tyrell took the back exit, sticking to the shadows as they made their way through the alleyways. But the pursuers were relentless. A black SUV screeched around the corner, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Deshaun pushed Tyrell behind a dumpster, pulling out the pocket knife he always carried. "Go," he whispered. "I'll hold them off." Tyrell shook his head, but Deshaun didn't give him a choice. He stepped out into the open, drawing the men's attention. Tyrell took the opportunity to slip away, his heart heavy with guilt. He didn't look back. The hours that followed were a blur of chaos and fear. Jamal's family made it to a safe location, but the group remained scattered. Maya managed to evade her pursuers, finding refuge in an abandoned warehouse. Tyrell made it to a friend's house, where he began coordinating with Agent Carter to regroup. Deshaun was captured, his fate unknown. Despite the turmoil, the exposé continued to spread. News stations picked up the story, airing clips of the video and conducting interviews with community members. The pressure on the police department reached a boiling point, and protests outside City Hall swelled to unprecedented numbers. But the corrupt forces weren't going down without a fight. That evening, as the protests reached their peak, Jamal received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, his stomach twisting with anxiety. "Jamal," a deep voice said. "We have your friend. Deshaun." Jamal's heart sank. "What do you want?" "Your evidence. All of it. Turn yourself in, and we'll let him go." The line went dead. Jamal's hands trembled as he relayed the message to Tyrell and Maya. "It's a trap," Maya said, her voice shaking with anger. "They won't let him go. They'll kill him and you." "We can't just do nothing," Jamal argued. "Deshaun risked everything for this." Tyrell leaned forward, his expression grim. "Then we turned their trap against them." The group worked through the night, devising a plan to rescue Deshaun while ensuring their evidence remained safe. Agent Carter, finally convinced of the depth of the conspiracy, agreed to help. He mobilized a team of trusted agents, coordinating a raid on the location where Deshaun was being held. As dawn broke, the operation began. Jamal and Tyrell joined Carter's team, their nerves steeled by determination. The warehouse where Deshaun was held was heavily guarded, but the element of surprise was on their side. Gunfire erupted as Carter's team stormed the building. Jamal and Tyrell moved through the chaos, their focus on finding Deshaun. They found him in a back room, bruised but alive. Deshaun's eyes widened in relief as they cut his restraints. "We've got to go," Tyrell said, helping him to his feet. But their escape was cut off by Randall himself. The corrupt officer stood in the doorway, a gun in his hand and a sneer on his face. "You think you've won?" he spat. "This town belongs to me." Jamal stepped forward, his voice steady. "Not anymore." Before Randall could react, Agent Carter appeared behind him, disarming him with a swift move. The room erupted into chaos as Carter's team secured the area, ensuring everyone's safety. By the end of the day, Randall and several of his accomplices were in custody, their crimes laid bare for the world to see. The police department was placed under federal investigation, and the community of Oakwood began the long process of healing. Jamal, Tyrell, Maya, and Deshaun stood together at the protest that evening, their faces illuminated by the glow of candlelight. The fight had cost them dearly, but they had prevailed. For the first time in what felt like forever, hope filled the air.